computer. Hi everyone, and today I want to introduce you to Sarah Osborne, who is joining me from her practice So Nutrition today. Hi Sarah, how are you today?
Hi Sue, I'm really well, thank you, and thanks so much for inviting me onto the call today.
Oh no, it's lovely to chat to you. I know we kind of met just by chance and we started chatting. And when you started telling me about all the different things that you did in your practice, I was just fascinated. So I thought you'd be a great person to have a chat to, and you'd have loads of information. I'm sure there are loads of our course members who can relate to what we're going to talk about today. So would you tell us, to start off with, would you tell us a little bit more about what you do and why you do it?
Yeah, absolutely, thank you. So yeah, as you said, I'm working from my clinic, which is So Nutrition, and I actually so I'm a bank registered nutritionist. So I retrained after a long career in corporate training and management, which had become quite stressful and unfulfilling. I decided actually in my mid-40s to take the plunge and do what I'd wanted to do for a really long time, which was retrain and go back to college. So I embarked on this sort of 3.5, 4 year retraining program to become a nutritionist. And I did that actually because I saw a nutritionist myself by chance to help me with my asthma and eczema, which as I'd got into perimenopause had become much, much worse. And a friend said she's seen a nutritionist, and I'd never connected asthma and eczema with food or nutrition. I didn't even know what a nutritionist did, apart from judge me on my food, which is what I was expecting to happen. Anyway, I saw this wonderful lady, and she gave me some changes to make to my diet and also some lifestyle changes. And I did those, and within about 6 months, I was medication free for my asthma. I'd gone from being steroid dependent to not having to use any medication. So I really got my head in that journey around the power of nutrition, really, which we don't in the West particularly think about or focus on really at all. So I thought, yeah, that's what I want to do. So I went back to uni, and then in the middle of that, we hit 2020, found ourselves in lockdown, all of us. And it was at that point that my husband and my son started on a journey to get diagnosed with ADHD. Now, I had been studying nutrition for various different conditions, and autism had come up, but ADHD had never come up at college. I didn't even really know what it was. It was a chance conversation with a fellow dog walker that I came home and thought, oh my gosh, hang on a second, you mean all those different things about my husband and my son that I've never been able to understand, all those quirks and behavior traits and things that honestly I've sometimes found quite difficult. They were actually a thing.
Can you tell me a bit more about what you mean by your husband and your son having ADHD diagnosis and how that helped you to understand the way they ate?
Yes, so it was, as I said, I'd been with my husband at 20 years at that point. My son was 18, sadly, so he'd already been through education and white-knuckled that situation without the benefit of a diagnosis. So it had never been mentioned to me, but there were certain things that my husband did all the way through our marriage that, if I'm absolutely honest, and I've got his permission to say this, at various points I genuinely thought he was gaslighting me. It's like, what's going on with that? In terms of our finances, just little things he'd do, like sort of bring the dog home wet from every walk and leave the door open, and the dogs would jump on the sofas full of mud, and he'd do this on repeat. And I'd think, but also he was a really successful entrepreneur, with sort of real sort of things that had been amazing that he'd done. He was also becoming at that point a full-blown alcoholic. So there was lots going on with him. And when it came to food, I now realise that he was a binge eater, but I had never really understood that's what was happening. I didn't understand why when I'd cooked a really healthy meal and he was coming home from work, he would be too full to have it. But then later on, I'd find he got a McDonald's on the way home to the house.
That's,
And
that's really interesting, the kind of things that you've discovered
then,
with within your relationship, how people with ADHD, their relationship with food is so different.
Yeah, well, it's important to know that one person with ADHD is one person with ADHD. I've been working in this clinic sector for a long time now, and although there are definite traits that come with an ADHD diagnosis, they can show up very differently. My husband and my son are very different. My husband, as I say, to use these terms loosely, eats a lot, eats quickly, binge eats, prefers carb-based foods. My son struggles to eat, struggles to get the appetite signals. But both of these are the result of when you hear about ADHD, you'll hear people talk about focus and attention. That's what you'll hear. People can't focus and they can't pay attention. That's not true. That's not really how ADHD shows up at all. I think of ADHD in terms of dopamine and an imbalance, if you like, in dopamine. The executive functions that we use in our brain to plan and organize and, sort of just run our life, and emotions. And these are really the ways that ADHD will show up for most people. And those things can really impact our food choices. So a person with ADHD, it's not that food's had any relationship to causing ADHD. There's no evidence for that, really. It's how ADHD is showing up in terms of your appetite, your relationship with food, your ability to feel hungry or feel full, and that not really quite working very well. And sometimes just your ability to plan and organize meals. Lots of my clients, because that requires a lot of executive functioning to choose what to eat, not just for yourself, but for family members who are probably also neurodivergent, because this very much runs in families. Shopping, cooking, prepping, that's a lot of decision making going on. And for lots of people with ADHD, that can be really overwhelming. So there can be, for some of my clients, real genuine struggles, real upset and shame and distress around the sort of thing about what healthy food is and how to get it.
Interesting. And you talked to me before about women having different traits. And how does that affect the way they eat?
Yes, so as I say, there's the traits of ADHD can vary person to person. And what we know is that the ADHD diagnosis is it's created around really young boys and how ADHD shows up in them. And we now know that for women in particular, we've got to factor extra things in, like societal expectations are different for women, but also estrogen comes along and plays a huge role in the way women function, and men don't have to factor that in, obviously, not as much anyway. But also what we've realised now is that estrogen plays a really important role in dopamine. So simply put, good levels of estrogen, good access to dopamine, low levels of estrogen, really struggling to get dopamine. So if you're a woman with ADHD and you think about the hormone fluctuations that go through just in a month, but then when we hit perimenopause and menopause and the much bigger fluctuations, then women will often experience that as much more up and down in their ADHD traits. So traits of ADHD appearing much stronger at certain points of the month. And that can really affect appetite and food behaviour. So cravings can become much more intense, mood and food can become much more intertwined. Blood sugar imbalance, estrogen has a really important role in, everything in our body works together. So estrogen's a brain chemical, it affects our metabolism. So lots of my female clients will have sort of really experienced just not understanding the way their appetites work, and they'll probably have tried lots and lots of different diets, because dopamine is a novelty-based, very strong novelty-based neurotransmitter. It wants something shiny, new, exciting, constantly. You need to, when you get quite a big dopamine hit from our modern diet, if you have ADHD, you're probably getting a much bigger hit from that high sugar, high salt, high fat food. So dopamine will drive you hard towards that. So no matter how hard you're trying to motivate yourself to stay focused on something, dopamine's in the background going, we need this, do that behavior again. That really worked last time, I make you feel good. So you've got this real double whammy that for some women, not all, but for many, can be really problematic.
Could you give me some examples of the type of food that women would eat in those situations and the way they would eat them?
Yeah, so as I said, if you think about us as a species, as humans, we don't just do anything. We're the result of all chemical messages in our body. Dopamine's job is we've only been living the way we're living now and eating the way we're eating now for a very short time of our evolution. For the millions of years beforehand, it was much harder to find and get food. If we think of the millions of years we spent as hunter-gatherers, dopamine was the one that said, right, get up, get out, find food for yourself, for your family, in hostile conditions and environmental challenges. And in our world, food that's high in sugar, salt, and fat in a combination is not readily available. It doesn't really exist in nature. It exists in our modern diet. So we needed a very strong motivator to go and find food, and especially in winter times, in difficult situations. So dopamine doesn't understand that all we have to do now is open our cupboard and open a packet with some donuts or a croissant in. It just thinks, great, that's a good food. That's got good calories, good sugar. That's going to keep us going and give us plenty of energy. It doesn't understand that actually there are health implications that come with huge amounts of that sort of food. And dopamine teaches us how to behave. It habit forms. So dopamine's mostly been studied in its role in addiction, like heavily studied. It is the dopamine, it is the neurotransmitter that we understand to do with alcoholism, drug addiction, those sorts of things. But it does the same with food. So, and it's very powerful. We don't just feel hungry or full or happy or sad. Chemicals are happening in our body. So when we have this very dopaminergic diet, the diet that's easy to get and gives us lots of calories and lots of sugar and lots of salt, for some of us, the urge towards that is much stronger than others because they already have a lower, a baseline of dopamine. So foods that are more difficult to cook and prepare, are probably more nutritious, but take more time, give a much lower dopamine hit. And we have all those other factors to consider, the executive functions, as I say. So the hyper focus and attention that can come with ADHD means that people will often suddenly stop a task that they spent a long time really focused on and be suddenly really starving and really hungry. And those appetite, those ghrelin and leptin signals are much sort of stronger. So they're not really wanting then to sort of start chopping veg and making a soup. It's sort of opening a cupboard and getting what's immediately available and palatable. But as I said, that's not everybody. Some of my clients love cooking and love food prep. It's just consistency can be a real issue because they're sort of, working with these emotional regulation issues that can come along. Most people I'd speak to have been lately diagnosed with ADHD. They have had a late diagnosis. So they spent all their childhood and all their formative years not knowing that's what it was. So food relationships have developed in layers over time, often alongside a lot of stress and internalized anxiety.
So when someone first presents to you, they may not, would they know they got an ADHD diagnosis, or would they just come to you thinking perhaps something they'd heard suggested to them that possibly they could have ADHD? How would you start working with them?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting you say that because for me, I advertise my services as I'm a neurodivergent ADHD coach. That's what I do in nutrition. So my clients have come to me, you've either heard me talk in an ADHD capacity and thought, yeah, that's me, or they are seeking a diagnosis, which is lots of people, the waiting list in the UK are huge because before 2006, you couldn't get an adult diagnosis. So that's why there's such a big backlog of people that weren't picked up, especially women, in childhood. So my clients know they have ADHD traits, or they're waiting for a diagnosis, or they have a diagnosis. But I also lecture and supervise at the clinic where I was taught. So I see people coming in for lots of different things, and I can tell while I'm observing the nutritionist, I can think this person more than likely has undiagnosed ADHD, and that's what's driving their relationship with food, and they haven't yet picked that up or been presented with that information. But more importantly, neither has the nutritionist. So the information they're being given and told, actually, I know is going to be quite unhelpful and potentially tip an already vulnerability to a bit of disordered eating into more disordered eating.
That's so interesting. Could you give us an example of that?
Yes, so I mean, when I think about the sort of plans I was taught to put together in the protocols in clinic, now I shudder a bit because they're very much restrict, remove, replace, restrict your intake of simple carbohydrate food and instead steam 3 portions of broccoli and have some wild Alaskan salmon. That's the way to be, nutrient dense. Not practical, takes a lot of prep. We sort of were taught to avoid definitely ultra processed food and convenience food and sort of gear somebody towards this sort of 8 or 9 point plan of nutritional health.
Right.
I never now use the words restrict, remove, or replace in my clinic. They are kind of banned. It's all what we can add in. I don't do 3-day diet diaries because they are really triggering and unhelpful. And I'll quite often just focus on 1 or 2 small things to sort of try and build a client's confidence, but also awareness around why they're making the decisions they're making around food. If you restrict and replace and remove things from somebody who's already got a bit of an issue with dopamine will just double down and say, where's my Haribos? Where have they suddenly gone? And drive behavior in a way. So instead it's about, having the things that the client enjoys, but adding things in that are going to really retrain dopamine a bit, feed the microbiome, help with that gut-brain axis. Lots of my work is around that gut-brain signaling.
So what type of foods would you then be recommending that the client adds in?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you. So we start with the basic building blocks. We start with protein. And that's probably quite a well-known thing, but what I do is I start with the protein that's accessible to my client. So if that means including a range of convenience foods in their cupboards and their fridge that are a bit longer life, that's amazing. So lots of my work is around saying, where are you at now? How are you with food prep? What else is going on in your life? Who else have we got to factor in your home? What's your time like in terms of food? What do you like? Right, now let's look at how we can get a good source of 4 or 5 different sorts of protein into that, often alongside what you're already doing. So a really good example I just said about Haribos, because Haribos I think make a lot of money from lots of sort of my client base. They're a very, very dopaminergic food. They're very accessible. We'll just have those with other things at the same time. So if my clients like nuts and seeds, they're a great thing to add in. That's just sort of one example. If they're sort of having breakfast and they're having oats because they've heard that's really good, that's good and it is good, but have we got some protein in there with that? And sometimes that we throw out food rules. So sometimes that's, well, I really like peanut butter. Great. So we're going to have a little plate of peanut butter on the side with some sliced apples at the same time you're having your oats. So it really is about working on not worrying about what you think healthy food is and looks like, because a tin of tuna is a really healthy food, a tin of beans, jars that you can have from your cupboard. We don't need to be worrying about steaming, like I said, wild Alaskan caught salmon. That's not necessarily what health is for many of my clients. And lots of my clients are taking medications which really impact their appetite as well. So it's looking at when are the time for my clients to eat. Do we have to do a breakfast, lunch and dinner? Is that a model we necessarily need? Did we evolve as a species having breakfast, lunch and dinner? And what is breakfast? If we're having a turkey sandwich for breakfast and overnight oats before we go to bed, great. That's absolutely fine. So a lot of it's about reframing what we think of as healthy food, especially in our, modern world where healthy food, everyone's got an opinion on what that is, especially in the social media space, and lots of those people aren't really qualified to talk about what healthy food is. So yeah.
Brilliant. So when you start taking someone through that journey of changing their relationship with food in their ADHD world, if that sort of way, how long would it take before a person actually started to have a much healthier relationship with food?
That's another really great question, and the first thing I try and do is I try and sort of switch on to where they're at right now, and sort of being really kind and forgiving about that. So that's the first stage. And actually, sometimes for some people that can take a little time. The end goal is that we have somebody sort of eating intuitively. That's the end goal. But we can't take someone from where they're at to sort of doing an intuitive eating plan. We need to sort of really build those foundations. I've got clients who I've spent sort of 3 months just getting them to increase their water intake. And we don't move on until that happens, until that client's sort of drinking a couple of glasses of water a day. And we've found the way to make that doable. And if there are people listening on the call who have ADHD, they'll probably understand that, that actually can be a real issue. Because that's foundational. There's no point me starting to talk about making a chia jam recipe so we can up the omega-3 status for my clients and really help with the focus and attention till we've got, those cornerstones right. Some of my clients, what I have found in my clinic is that when I work with my clients, once they sort of start to get the thing that works for them, the compliance is amazing and the results come through really well. Whereas my 18 months working with asthma and eczema clients while I was doing my dissertation and clinical hours, the compliance was okay. It was hit and miss. It was probably about 60%. The results were okay. When I work with somebody with ADHD and we get it and they get it and we start to peel that onion and we look at the actual practical steps we need to put in place to remove some of those barriers, then we actually see it with my husband and my son as well. So it's really quite profound changes. It's just having the knowledge and having the foundations and being patient and being really, really kind and forgiving. That's a big part of my clinic work because there's often been so much rejection and dysphoria and shame around food that's hidden. So the minute we say food's just food, behaviour's just behaviour, we need to work on this till we get that right and make that appealing to your dopamine senses. So we formed a habit and then we can build on there.
About building those small habits and then building on top of them, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Whatever your reason, wherever you are, when you're wanting to get rid of fat, the first step is to start looking at the habits you've got and how you can start putting another habit in its place. Absolutely. And James on the course talks about habit stacking and changing the habits. It's really fascinating once you start really getting into it. And the effects are profound, aren't they?
They are. That's, I think, the tendency with ADHD is always to go for the next big thing. All or nothing. All or nothing thinking is really huge. So keto diet, or fasting five, all these things that seem to have the answers if we just change everything. So it's often about saying, no, we're going to just change one
What?
small and promise me this small step is the first step to make big, big changes, as opposed to sort of throwing everything out. Because that all or nothing thinking is,
That 1% incremental change, and it just keeps going, doesn't it? It's great.
absolutely,
Great.
yeah.
And can I just ask, how are your husband and your son now?
Thank you so much for that. Like I said, it was 2020 when we were so fortunate we've actually been able to get diagnosis because we did have to pay. It's an expensive job to do in the UK at the moment. So we're very fortunate that they had the diagnosis and that I was able to go, right, new lens here. So neurodiversity, what is this? What's happening? And do some really targeted work. So my he's been sober for 3 years in October this year, which is amazing. But quite profound changes in his life as a result of that. Initially, that meant that he switched that alcohol onto sugar, and the diet went quite a bit worse for about 4 or 5 months. And that had an impact on his microbiome. So I do lots of functional testing, and we really sort of looked at that and looked at some of the genetic SNPs that we have and vulnerabilities and put him a very targeted plan in place. And when we found what worked for him, within 6 months, he was a different person physically, metabolically, in terms of his health parameters, his weight. He'd never been able to find the thing that shifted the weight, put it bluntly, even though he'd done lots of different things. They weren't for long enough and they weren't sustainable, and they were that cycle of it's not doable long term. So so he's incredibly well. He actually even though he was 51, 52 last year, he got his black belt in Taekwondo as well. So yeah, he's doing really well. And my son, he's 21. I was just about to go off to uni. He's the chef in our house. You know, he loves food. He's gone from having a very limited small diet to he really does knock out some, you know, very amazing dishes. It's a good job I like cleaning after him because there's always you get sort of one good thing, but that's good. We just embrace the chaos because the end result is somebody who loves food, loves experimenting, loves cooking, and it's all about, you know, reconnecting with food and what it's there for and what its job is to do for us. So he's really well, thank you.
That's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. So if anyone wanted to get in touch with you, Sarah, if anyone's thinking, actually, as I'm hearing this, that kind of is how I am, how I feel, how would they get in touch with you?
Well, I'm available on sort of all social media channels as at So Nutrition. And my website is simply www.atsonutrition. So it's sonutrition.co.uk. And there's lots of explanations about my work and the sort of the things we talked about on my website.
Uh-huh. And just finally, we were talking, how did you come up with So Nutrition?
When I was in my second year, we had to sort of start seeing clients and be observed for 100 hours, and we had to quickly think of a name for a company. And I just used my two initials. I just put SO Nutrition, and they called out from the platform and said, "Okay, now it's So Nutrition." And my colleague and friend Faye, who's a branding expert, said, "You need to stick with that. That sounds really good." So it sort of came from a very quick decision, and I listened to my friend who's a branding expert. So it's just easy to remember as well.
Really, you need to introduce me to your friend.
Yeah, yeah, she's a menopause nutrition expert. We're doing an ADHD menopause Zoom platform together.
Okay, fascinating. Sarah, thank you so much for your time today. It's
Oh,
been really lovely chatting to you, as always. I learn something new every day. Just before we close, there was something that you shared with me that I was really interested in. Not, it's just not about nutrition, but it's about the prison population.
mm,
Would you mind just share? It's just, it's something that really interested me.
yeah.
Do you mind sharing that?
Yeah, not at all. It's fascinating. So obviously, I've pretty much ADHD is my life now from getting up to going to bed. It's my home life and my personal life and my professional life. So it's something that I'm enormously passionate about people understanding more about. And you know, ADHD can sometimes be called a superpower in the social media space, and people within the community aren't too keen on that. But it does mean that people have the ability to hyper focus and do brilliant things. But it can also, when you have ADHD in a neurotypical world and you've been through the school system and the school system has really kind of crushed you in a way, because with ADHD, you need to move and create and think and innovate. And in school, you have to sort of sit still. And so you end up being given the label of naughty child or naughty boy or naughty girl. And when you tip out into the world and it's not built for you, those two things together can cause a real clash. And there are lots of studies into what the real downside for the population and for the individual can be when that happens. And so there's studies now looking at the prison population, and there are lots of people, lots of actual prison officers and police who've been diagnosed with ADHD, who are very passionate about this. And they're looking at the percentage being anywhere between sort of 50 and in some studies 80% of certain prison population. So people who are in prison not for sort of serious crime or you know, murder, but for breaking society's rules, you know, uh, minor offences around drugs, alcohol, driving offences in particular, you are much more at risk of committing these offences or serving a prison sentence or having a non-custodial sentence if you have particularly undiagnosed ADHD. And there's been some studies around when they actually diagnose and give people the appropriate treatment that we have for ADHD. The issues we see in prison, the reoffending rates come down dramatically.
Mm.
So in my opinion, not understanding ADHD, not diagnosing ADHD is a public health concern, not just in terms of our prison population, but the exclusions in schools, the bullying in schools that's happening, disordered eating, people not being able to hold down jobs and stay in the workplace because the modifications aren't there that they need in the way they need to work. So a lot of these problems are preventable with understanding what an ADHD brain is like, how it needs to work, and what you will do if you sort of put a really neurotypical framework into that person's life and expect them to live and work that way can actually be quite catastrophic.
Okay. Fascinating. The more I talk to you, the more fascinating I find it all. So thank you
Oh,
so
thank you.
much for your time today. It's been lovely to talk to you again. And I'm sure we'll talk again in the future. And if any of our clients and course members have any questions for you, and they pop them in our group or anything like that, I will pass them on and get you to reply if that's okay.
Oh, thank you, Sue. It's been such a pleasure meeting you, and I've loved looking at your website and the work you do. I think it's absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm sure we'll speak again very soon. But in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for sharing all that with us today, and we'll
Thank
speak to
you.
you soon. Bye bye.